Angela Rutter, the co-director from Common Cause, who'll be talking about moving people to action. Please make Angela very, very welcome.
So I'm going to spend the next probably 20-25 minutes or so talking about moving people to action, predominantly from a values-based perspective, and you'll find there's very similar themes to what you've heard this morning from Jane and Giselle and David as well. So I'll be building on some of those ideas. I'll also talk about the work that we're doing with Darebin Council on the engagement and communications project around the climate emergency, and also keen just to share some insights coming from that work in terms of the substance, but also the process, and then some broader insights around thoughts about what moves people to action and how we can apply those in practice. So just in terms of the context for this work, it comes out of Common Cause came out of some work that was done by Tom Crompton when he was a change strategist at WWF. And what he was doing was looking at how values interact with particular strategies around social and environmental concern. And one of the key pieces of insight from the work that he was doing in relation to the Common Cause report, but then also earlier work where he was looking at environmental identity and leadership, was that actually some of the strategies that were being deployed by organisations and groups were actually working against the very purpose and concern that they were trying to build. So he was starting to, I guess, ask questions around how values interrelate with our environmental and social concerns in terms of attitudes and behaviours, but then also how they create the space for civic expression and participation across a broad range of issues. So one of the things that sits at the heart of this work is that actually we all share a common cause. So we might be looking through particular lenses in terms of issues that we're focused on, but what we're actually trying to do is there's a very strong common thread in terms of the values that underpin that, and also the sort of participation and civic engagement that we're looking at. The other aspect is thinking about and which has also been talked about this morning, and I'll pick up again later on, is actually how we create transformational change and the importance of speaking the truth to that change that is required, as opposed to, trying to soften the blow and take a more incremental approach. So really looking at what is the transformation that's required and how do we speak to that in a way that actually moves people to action and mobilises people around that. Just briefly, I just want to talk a little bit to this particular map, which is a values map. And it's some work that was done by Professor Shalom Schwartz and has been built on by several other academics and practitioners. And some of the key aspects of this particular work are that we all hold all values, and it's been correlated across cultures and across countries. The other aspect is that values underpin our motivation. So when we talk about how we move people to action, one of the things that we need to be considering is what are the motivations that we're activating, and are they actually supporting action for the long term and supporting concern and engagement for the long term. So I think one of the paradoxes is the desire for people to take action in contrast to whether that action is actually counter to the very things that we're concerned about. The other aspect is that values can be engaged temporarily and also long-term over time. And this is, the short-term aspect of this is referred to as priming. So if I walked up to you, for instance, and introduced myself and said, "So what do you do?" and you responded about your particular status and your job, etc., that would prime a particular response. Whereas if we talk about our relational context, maybe your role as a parent or the different ways in which you engage in society, that's priming again different values and different approaches. The other aspect of this is the interrelationship between the values. So what you're looking at is a mapping of the way in which the values relate to each other. And there is something called a spillover effect, which means that if you engage one value, it spills over into others. And there is also something called a seesaw effect, which means if you engage values on one side of the map, you then suppress values on the opposite. And the reason that this is of particular interest is the association between particular values and attitudes and behaviours that are displayed. So if you're engaging values that sit in achievement and power, which is predominantly around things like social recognition and status and social power in terms of power over people and power over others, then you're actually going to be suppressing values that sit across on this side. So the type of things that are associated with these sort of values when they're activated in individuals and cultures are things like anxiety and depression, high environmental footprint, strong nationalism, as in and out groups, military solutions, hostile sexism and social dominance orientation. Conversely, when you engage values that sit across this side, the sort of attitudes and behaviours that you will activate are things like volunteering. So just the act of volunteering is associated with self-direction, universalism and benevolence values. Political activism, so civic engagement sits very much at the top in association with self-direction and universalism values. And things like interest in issues that are bigger than your own self-interest. So the common good is associated with values that are sitting at the top. So one of the things in terms of the work that we do at Common Cause is we look at how we actually engage those more common interest values as opposed to the self-interest values. Another interesting aspect to that particular map is also the two axes that run across it. So one axis is about self-transcendence and self-enhancement. But interestingly, the other one is about openness to change and also conservatism, so conservation, which is more about maintaining the status quo. Openness to change, which is associated with self-direction values, is, as I said before, where civic engagement will tend to sit, and openness to new ideas and doing things differently. So, for instance, if you're thinking about, if you're thinking about the type of values in self-direction, we heard this morning about creativity, the importance of creativity and openness to new ideas and new solutions. Curiosity, choosing your own goals, freedom. So if you're thinking about solar, for instance, there's a range of different ways that you could express different engagement tactics and communication approaches around freedom, curiosity, choosing your own goals in relation to solar. So I just want to give you two quick examples of what this looks like in terms of priming particular behaviour responses. So one example is a study that was done on car sharing, and they had 4 groups, so a control group and 3 other groups. One group was given a quiz for car sharing, and they were given environmental reasons for car sharing. The other group was given financial reasons for car sharing, so very much down in this space in terms of achievement. And the third group were given financial and environmental reasons for car sharing in the quiz. So they filled out the quiz, but the thing that they were actually looking at, the researchers, was what was the behaviour that resulted. And they asked people to put the quiz in a bin, and there were 2 options. One was a recycle bin and one was not. And what they found is, not surprisingly, the people that were given the environmental reasons for car sharing had a higher rate of recycling their quiz in the bin. But the interesting thing was people that were given both financial and environmental reasons performed no better than the control group. And one of the reasons for this is the crowding out of when you engage the more extrinsic values, self-interest values, and the flow-on effect that they have in terms of common good values. So they tend to crowd out that sense of the common good. The other example that I just wanted to talk briefly to is this spillover effect that I mentioned before, which is about, in this particular instance, they were priming the value of helpfulness, which you can see is just above benevolence, the block, benevolence, so honesty and helpfulness. And what they did in this instance is they had, again, 3 groups, one a control group, one other group that was given asked to think about reasons for and against loyalty and honesty. So you can see on that map, loyalty and honesty is just near helpfulness. They were asked to think about that. And then the second group was asked to think about reasons for and against success and ambition, which sit down in the achievement space. And again, what the researchers were looking at was the behaviour that resulted from people being active, from people actively thinking about those qualities and values. So the test was that when people returned with their quiz, is the research assistant spilt pencils every single time. So knocked over the pencils, and what they were looking for was who actually helped pick up the pencils. So they're activating the helpfulness value and the behaviour associated with it. And people that were asked to think about loyalty and honesty were the ones that were likely to help pick up the pencils. And so that's just a simple priming example from a straight test. The other piece I just wanted to touch on was in terms of the role of metaphor and what that does in terms of broader responses. So this particular study is by Thibodeau and Borodetsky, and what they were looking at was two different ways of describing crime and the impact on people's propensity to support a particular policy. So one way in which they described crime was as a beast, so very much, out of control, energetic, needs to be tamed, etc., lurking in our neighbourhoods. The other way in which crime was described was crime as a virus, so crime plaguing our neighbourhoods. And what they found was that when crime was described as a beast, people were more likely to support a strong law and order response. So lock people away, throw away the key, clamp down law and order. When crime was described as a virus, there was greater support for social reform. So the impact of metaphor on policy solutions can be quite dramatic in terms of what people are likely and more activated to support or not. Here's an example of a metaphor. So you probably remember, I think it was last year, when this report came out about the Great Barrier Reef being worth $54 billion to the economy. So for me, this is particularly interesting because, firstly, it put the Great Barrier Reef as subservient to the economy, for a start. Secondly, it created this notion, so even just implied in this particular headline, of the Great Barrier Reef actually being more like a bank, and the idea of the reef being an economic instrument, if you like, of our economy, as opposed to the other way in which you could frame it, which would be about $54 billion the economy depends on a healthy Great Barrier Reef. It's a completely different way of actually setting up the story and the framing. And then finally, the other twist, I guess, in the tale, which was also mentioned by the panel this morning, is around social norming and perceptions. So Common Cause in the UK has done a study called Perceptions Matter, and it has now been run in 3 different samples, one of which was a broader UK sample, but also they have been doing some work with the Greater Manchester region as well, with the mayor there. And one of the things that they found is that there is a disconnect between our perception of what we care about and what we perceive other people to care about. So in this instance, what they were looking at is if you asked people, do they have more compassionate common good values, 74% of people identify strongly as they are the values that they hold. When you ask people, what do you think others hold, most people will say other people are selfish, their values sit down in this space. So there is a really big disconnect between our perception of the other. And we've seen this play out as well in Cyro's study on climate change, where when you ask people about what percentage of the Australian population doesn't believe in climate change, people would say 24%. And when you ask people who is actually of that view, it's 8%. So again, there's that distortion effect that's going on. Now you might think, well, people overclaim in research, etc. So that was actually built into the study in terms of, identifying if people were actually, putting themselves forward as being more compassionate, for instance, than what they might actually be. And what they found is that people tend to go the other way. They'll tend to identify themselves as being more selfish than what might actually be the case. So one of the reasons, or 2 reasons actually, why this is, I think, really critical bit of information. One is that it completely changes to me, the sort of strategies that we might develop if we think about people actually being, as I think Jane said this morning, they are deeply concerned, people are deeply concerned. And, often the question is actually about asking people to do something significant and meaningful in the context of the bigger problem and the bigger challenge. The other challenge that we have is, as this cartoon illustrates, is the role of the media and other powerful voices that will tend to amplify maybe not what is real and true about broader society, but actually pick off an aspect, which then creates a sense of that is all of society or that is the norm of society. I just want to talk briefly about the work that we're doing with Darebin Council, and then on to some of the insights that relate to that. So we're doing some work at the moment around motivating people to take tangible, meaningful and long-term lasting action, which is looking at communications and engagement. And I hesitate to use the word messages because I think one of the pieces that we need to think quite clearly about is what is the story that we're telling, and from that come the messages and the various other iterations of that. So we're looking at that particular piece of story development and how we communicate a clear, comprehensive story of the climate emergency, people's role in that and what the solutions are, so that people can play a meaningful part in it. And then we'll be doing some testing, which is actually using a method to understand what are the sort of stories and messages that connect with a base, so people who I imagine would all be in this room, the messages that connect with us, but also that connect with people who can be persuaded. And this is part of the movement building approach, is actually finding the ways in which you can unite and connect people as opposed to fragmenting people. Then the final piece is around how that learning and understanding is embedded and developed and tested and then adapted to programs, approaches, etc. So really taking a very strong distributed-based approach and ensuring that that learning is spread as far and as wide as people want to take it. So some of the themes that are starting to come through, which are not necessarily themes that would all be carried forward, but the first stage of the work that we were doing was actually a series of engagements with different groups, different clusters of people. So there's about 6 different gatherings that we had around that. And some of the themes were about the way in which we live, so being in harmony with nature or not, that we're a progressive community acting on climate change. And I think there is a sort of bigger watch out in terms of overlaying political language and the polarisation that can result in. Taking action on climate change can be easy or convenient. Climate change requires an emergency response very explicitly, and also we need to escape the cycle of overconsumption and what that might look like. So these are all being looked at and developed to work out what are the strongest territories to then take into this research approach. So some of the insights coming from the project so far. So those of you who were here last night and heard Jeremy talk, where he said, it's difficult work, and I think, that is absolutely an aspect of the reality in which we're in, is that it's challenging work, but I think, the difficulty and the gains and the insights to be gleaned from that are really quite profound. So some of the insights in the way in which the project is working is, I think it's really important to have strategic alignment on the mobilisation methods. So the idea of whether you're working to unite people or whether you're working on a sort of more segmentation approach in terms of understanding different groups, because that actually creates different strategies and different approaches. Understanding the diversity of views and I guess what sits behind the views as well is really important in terms of building a strong foundation. So part of this, I think, is often we can make assumptions about why people might think in particular ways, but really, I guess, trying to get behind that and understanding what is the sort of motivation and what are the concerns that are being expressed is really important. The third point is around, this is an adaptive challenge, not a technical challenge. So the adaptive aspect of it is, part of it is making the meaning as we go as well, so understanding the complexity in which we're in and the dynamic nature of that. And then also that it means significant change for all of us in terms of how we behave, relate, connect, group, work together, as opposed to, more technical challenges where it's the straight up solutions that we need to employ. So from my point of view, a lot of this is actually about how we work in a powerful way as a collective group and how we do this so that we can all contribute meaningfully to that solution. Story, not message, I've touched on, so it's getting our story straight, being clear about the different roles that people play within that story. It's buckshot, not silver bullet. And so what I mean by that is that I think, once you've got the story straight, then there's a range of different ways that story can be retold, whether it's through programs or activities or community groups or neighbourhoods, etc., as opposed to there's just a single aspect of that would be communicated. And takeout versus content. So this is really being clear about what we want people to do in terms of motivation as opposed to what we might want to be saying. And I think with climate emergency, we absolutely want people to have an emergency response. And that is part of testing and understanding what that looks like and how people go about that. So some broader insights on engagement and messaging, and this is a strong theme that's come out of this morning as well, is getting real. I read a paper many years ago, which probably some of you have also read, by Susan Moser, who's an American psychologist, and she wrote a paper called Getting Real About It, and it's about environmental leadership. And for me, it just explained a lot in terms of the context in which we're working, what we're trying to do, the ability to carry grief and love as one and recognise the connection between the two. So our first point has to be about getting real about the context in which we're operating in, speaking truth to power and building that trust, and being, I guess, really mindful of the trust that we carry of others when we reveal and talk about the reality of the situation. Otherwise, I guess two aspects. One is, if we're not real about it, we're wasting our time and other people's time on a lighter level. But also then we're not actually deploying the sort of strategies and tactics that we need to be doing. We're just mucking around the edges. So I think if we're telling ourselves a story or telling others a story of it's all going to be fine and therefore we can just do these sort of tactics, we're just wasting everyone's time. The second insight is around proximity. So it's a global story that we're telling, but we need to anchor it locally. So we need to really connect it to place, people, community in a way that is tangible and relatable for people. We need to talk about today, not the future. There's a great example of Barack Obama when he was, I can't remember which meeting it was, but he was in Brisbane and he was talking to a group of students at Queensland University, and he talked about the Great Barrier Reef and how he wanted his daughters and their children to be able to come and visit the Great Barrier Reef. Now, he could have said future generations, but he didn't. He talked about it in a way that was tangible and relatable. So actually talking about the immediacy, where we are today, as opposed to the distant future, which will just create or allow space, I guess, for more of that denial response. Story, so focusing on what unites us, what connects us, so that we can build a collective approach. I think one of the opportunities for us is actually the common good and how we build strategies and approaches that activate people as a group as opposed to the individualistic aspect of ourselves. Making sure that people have a clear role and agency in that collective story. So it's a big story. People need to have a role in that and they need to have something that is absolutely plausible. The solution also needs to be commensurate with the problem, and this is one of the challenges with climate emergency, is that in speaking truth to the situation, the solution that we talk about also needs to be absolutely commensurate with that, and people need to have that clear role within that story. And that is, we've talked this morning already about mobilisation and what that means, and inviting people into that so that they can have a real role and you can resolve some of that, the fear that arises when people understand and see the truth. The final 2 points are around we are, not they should, so us owning it. We are doing this, not they should be doing X, Y, Z, we're doing this. And also being very explicit about what we're talking about. So, we're talking about the air we breathe and we're talking about the water we drink. So being quite tangible and explicit about those things. And then finally, social norms. So how we normalise this through digital strategies, so online and offline, really building that social norm so that people can gather and be drawn towards it rather than actually feeling that it's something that's happening on the periphery. So normalising that behaviour and socialising it is absolutely critical in thinking about how we do that in our communities, but also in the digital space as well, and how we then tell that story so that other people feel confident and strong in their ability to engage in that as well. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's Sally Newell. One of the worries I've had is the idea of agency. So if you say that the part, and also an analysis of power. So if there isn't much of an analysis of power, and the quadrant of so if the opposite quadrant to your benevolence quadrant is downplayed, how can you effect change without leadership? How do we grow leadership within your framing?
Yep, thank you. So I guess in terms of power in that context, it's very much about power over. So it's what we experience at the moment in many ways. It's not distributed power, it's actually more authoritarian power in that context of the values. So in terms of how we create agency, part of it is the way in which we communicate the story and the role of people in that story. So that is talking about the collective, what we're doing, what we're asking and inviting people into, and then also how we start to create more distributed approaches so that we're actually enabling people to get on with things as opposed to it being centralised and tactical. Part of that leadership, so the question was specifically about leadership approaches, yeah. So part of the adaptive approach is actually how we diagnose that situation, so how we understand what is going on, the different interpretations of that, but then also energising others through talking to loss, so whether it's loss, I'm not talking about sort of environmental loss, I'm talking about more in terms of the things that we might change, give up, refocus in terms of our lives, and then also the way in which we communicate and invite people into leadership as, civic leadership as opposed to authoritarian leadership.
Hello, could you speak a little bit more about that common values between people that are quite different in terms of, people on the far right and far left who have quite different perspectives on some topics but actually have a common goal? That's the area where I'm currently working. Can you, how do you balance that? How do you actually exist in that environment?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of work around if we talk to the common values and don't overlay the sort of political language, then it actually creates the space for people to come together more. So if we're, if you think about the example before about parenthood, for instance, there's very strong common values that sit within parenthood that can be drawn upon. If you think about the campaign for marriage equality, that focused very much on love as the common connection. The challenge starts to arise when we're using frames that activate either the conservative or progressive values. So things like what George Lakoff calls the strict father language, which is very much, again, about sort of power over, is going to activate a more conservative approach. So we shouldn't be doing that sort of stuff. We should be speaking very much to the common values rather than overlaying political values. The other thing that's quite interesting in terms of the Perceptions Matter work is that what they found is that people that tend to be identify as being more progressive see conservatives as more different than what conservatives see progressive. So that also plays into how we might automatically think our starting point is quite different, as opposed to there's probably more unity than what we might automatically expect.
On one of your slides, you showed taking out the versus content. Would you like to explain that a little, please?
Yeah, so that point was around being clear about what your takeout is. So what it is that you want people to take out of the message or the tactic, as opposed to what the substance of the tactic is. So for instance, a key goal with what we've been talking about in terms of climate emergency is for people to take out is that it's an emergency. That's what we want people to take out, and we're very clear about that. The content is how we actually communicate that to generate that particular response. So they might be slightly different in the way in which the content is presented according to whichever audiences, but the takeout is the emergency response. So when you're looking at how we measure behaviours and things like that, a key aspect will be people's understanding that it's an emergency response that's required, or emergency action, however that's expressed.
I'm Helen, and I've got a croaky voice, sorry. I suppose something that's, worried me in recent times, as an example, as a case study example, was the introduction of the no plastic bags from supermarkets. And I was stunned at the pushback against that, the ferocity that came from people who I thought would have been cool with it. Now, I was in the ACT when exactly the same policy was implemented about 9 years ago, and it was fine. Nobody batted an eyelid, people just took their bags. But it seems to me that people are becoming far more locked in to their present. They're far more resistant to change and more frightened of changing.
Yes.
So I suppose it's that narrative, how you'd address that.
Yeah, so I think if... let's see if I can just quickly go back, because I think one of the things that is interesting, so if you think about that dynamic of openness to change and then status quo being around the security and conformity values. So if you take immigration, for instance, and so if you think about the public discourse around asylum seeking and immigration, say over the last 20 years. So one of the things that is not necessarily interesting, but is that it would have been very strongly in the benevolence space, so around social justice was how that public discourse was taking place for a long period of time. And then more recently, it's gone into the national security space. So that is activating values which are more aligned with wanting to retain the status quo as opposed to being open to change. How did that happen? So part of it was around the militarisation of that debate, the use of, border force as part of the language, the sort of visual imagery and things like that was happening. So it's very much pushed into that national security space. And one of our challenges that we're facing as a society is the rising of these values and what that then does as a flow-on effect in terms of closing people off to change, and also people locking down on protecting themselves as opposed to being more open to broader concern about others. The other thing to note is in terms of Australian values, so when they do the values survey for the Australian population, so universally, benevolence and universalism and self-direction generally come in 1, 2 and 3. And generally it's benevolence, it's number 1, and then there'll be sort of 2 or 3 between universalism, self-direction, and that is consistent across a whole range of different countries and cultures. And Australia is no different in that we prioritise benevolence first, universalism second, but interestingly, third for Australia is security. So that would suggest that those values are easily activated in our society, and there's a whole range of ways that they can be primed very easily. And a lot of our political debate, when you think about it, is very much down in this space. A lot of the if you think about when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, a lot of the language that he was employing was around creating otherising of groups. So, very strongly this idea of either you're in our group or you're outside of our group, and creating that sort of strong sense of differentiation between otherness, which pushes into those achievement and power values. So I think one of the opportunities for us is actually how we create a more compassionate society that activates in the self-direction universalism space and strongly engages in civic participation and civic behaviour, as opposed to people being locked down and selfish-driven behaviour.
Hi, so I'm Jane Morton. I don't know if you heard me talking earlier, but
yes, I did. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about the proposition that if people really understood we were facing catastrophe,
Yeah.
that billions of people could die, that the whole of human civilization could be destroyed, whether that would cut across, sort of left-wing, right-wing sort of values. Like usually in times of crisis, people do actually pull together. And whether if that was conveyed clearly, including the idea that conflicts and mass migrations that we're seeing now are the start of a meltdown that will affect all of us, whether you can't use that as part of compassionate framing to get people going in a way that cuts across left and right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you absolutely can. So I think part of the question for me in that context is how you then bring it down to a local level so that it doesn't seem really distant. So, telling that sort of bigger story of the threat as it's playing out, but then localising it into Darebin or the region so that people can then get a hold of it and do something. So for me, the key thing is how you resolve that threat in a way that mobilises people and doesn't sort of paralyse people. And there was a conversation before about different motivations and different emotions. So, like anger and outrage is a key emotion, but also making sure that's paired with the ability to make a difference. Otherwise, people will just sit in that space and you get very quickly into denial or different forms of that.
My name is Diane. In '93, as a member of the Nursing the Environment Special Interest Group of the Australian Nursing Federation, we ran a successful 2-day National Nursing Health Ecology Conference. And we approached the campaign based on the Untitled Chapter for Health Promotion as a common value, that health was defined as access to fresh air, clean water, healthy soils, and healthy ecosystems. Health professionals could relate to this, and that led to a lot of change in their practice. And also, people could relate to it as the definition for a healthy family, a healthy community. Yet, in our Western economy, ozone layer and fresh air and healthy soils is not part of the GNP. So even if we take out the fossil fuel of our economy, we need to replace it with something more as a common value, like healthy nations, healthy communities. What has been your experience about people related as,
so I guess,
as a common value?
So I think, what you were saying is absolutely spot on in terms of the common values that we talk to. And I mean, my experience has been when you talk about people being part of something that is better in whichever way you define it, so whether it's, healthy air, connected communities, etc., people respond to that very positively. When you ask people to participate, people respond very positively. So the way in which we express that, so whether it's healthy air, clean water, etc., definitely my experience is that it resonates very strongly for people and they can relate to it very easily. And if it then flows into different aspects of health, it's something that seems to connect and resonate.